I think one of the most extraordinary stories in London's 19th century history is that of the moment when Sun Yat-Sen, who became really the most important political leader in China in the 19th and early 20th century, was actually kidnapped, was dragged off the street in London and imprisoned in the embassy of the imperial government of China. I mean, very few people, if they stroll up Portland Place, will be aware that this was a scene of extraordinary danger. Sun Yat-sen was a wanted man. He had led an uprising in Guangzhou and fled China and in 1895, and he escaped China with a price on his head, arriving in Liverpool in 1896. Now, he came to London to escape execution by the Qing imperial government, but he also came because he knew he had a friend in London who was called Dr. Cantley, who lived at 46 Devonshire Place, a house which just happens to be around the corner from the Chinese embassy. Sun Yat-sen, as many people perhaps don't know, he was actually a skilled medical doctor, a trained surgeon. He had been trained in Hong Kong by Dr. James Cantley, who had moved from Charing Cross Hospital to Hong Kong, where he co-founded the Hong Kong College of Medicine, which later became the University of Hong Kong. He was a specialist in first aid and tropical diseases, and Sun Yat-sen was one of his many pupils. Dr. Cantley returned to London in 1895. And Sun Yat-sen, having arrived in London, got in touch with Dr. Cantley and came to see him, as Dr. Cantley said, nearly every day, and told me from time to time how he'd been passing his time. He proposed to go out and see the sights of London, and Dr. Cantley found him some lodgings in Gray's Inn Place, near the great sort of legal centre of London, if you like, where Cantley himself had lodged when he was a medical student. And you can still see the site of the building, and there's a plaque on the wall. The Chinese embassy were alerted by the Chinese embassy in New York to say Sun Yat-sen has come to London. And he was a revolutionary leader, a man with a price on his head, and the Qing imperial government was very keen to try and catch him. They employed a British detective agency to follow him, so they've got private spooks hiding behind the trees looking for Sun Yat-sen and following him. And very unusually, the reports by Slater's detective agency in London can still be found in the Chinese National Archives, because they were given to the government and therefore posted in the archives. One thing that's rather odd about the detectives is that they don't seem to have noticed Sun Yat-sen visiting Dr. Cantley's house, and also they don't seem to have been paid to work at the weekends, so their following Sun Yat-sen was a little bit patchy. But who was it who hired detectives to follow Sun Yat-sen? It seems most likely that it was a man called Sir Halliday Macartney, who was secretary and interpreter to the Chinese embassy. Now, he was an Englishman who had gone to China as part of the British Army Medical Corps from India onto China, and he joined General Gordon, the famous Chinese Gordon, fighting the Taiping rebels between 1863 and 1864. And he was present when the rebel Taiping leaders were captured, and he eventually married the daughter of one of these leaders. It's often referred to as a Taiping princess. He then served the Chinese government in the Nanjing arsenal and eventually became secretary to one of the early Chinese ambassadors to London, Gong Zhaoyuan, in 1877, and he came back to London to serve as a kind of British intermediary employed by the Chinese embassy. So the Chinese embassy in London had been warned by the Chinese embassy in New York about Sun coming, and Macartney, Halliday Macartney, representing the Chinese embassy, went to the Foreign Office, the British Foreign Office, and asked that Sun Yat-sen be deported. This was refused. Chinese embassy the British Home Office wasn't going to deal with them in that way. So the detectives were employed to follow him. And on the 14th of October, we know that Macartney contacted a friend who worked for a major shipping line, the Glen shipping line, and he organised the charter of a ship to take Sun back to China. He spent £7,000, which is worth actually £900,000 today. So he's chartering an entire ship to take Sun back to China. But Sun Yat-Sen is still wandering around London, followed by the detectives. And we can trace Sun's daily route which he took when he went to visit Dr. Canley. If he starts in Gray's Inn Place, he walks along Holborn and along Oxford Street, and then he gets to Portland Place, goes up Portland Place, and just at the very top turns left into Devonshire Street. Now, what Sun didn't know was that one of the buildings he passed in Portland Place every day as he went to visit Dr. Cantley was in fact the Chinese embassy. There was no flag, there was no brass plate saying this is the Chinese embassy. It was just a house. And on the 11th of October, 1896, Sun Yat-Sen just disappears. And where's he gone? What happened? Nobody saw anything. The detectives weren't working on a Sunday, so all we know is that the Cantleys thought, where is he? He should be here. As I say, Sun didn't know that he had been passing the Chinese embassy all the time. There was no indication it was a Chinese embassy. And he said later that he was pulled into the building. The embassy later claimed that he'd gone in voluntarily and frequently visited, but that's denied by Sun Yat-Sen. So he's taken into the embassy and held there. Now, the Chinese embassy knew that it would not be easy to smuggle him back to Guangzhou. They've got to get past the British police, he's not willing, and so on. Even with diplomatic immunity, it's not easy. And so between the 11th and the 17th of October, Sun Yat-Sen, imprisoned, locked into a room in Portland Place in the Chinese embassy, tries to send 8 or 9 messages to Dr. Cantley, who he knows is just literally round the corner. He tries to send them through another Englishman employed by the Chinese embassy, the porter, George Cole, who just does the fetching and carrying. But all of these messages got passed to Halliday Macartney, who is in effect Sun Yat-Sen's jailer. But on the 17th, Sun Yat-Sen gave George Porter, George Cole, the porter of the embassy, he gave him £20 to take a note to Dr. Cantley. Now, £20 is the equivalent of £1,600. So that is an enormous sum. I mean, even £20 was probably almost as much as George Cole would have earned in several months. So it's a huge amount of money. And that message does get through, that it was worth every penny. When Dr. Cantley in Devonshire Street, just round the corner from the embassy, received the note, he went straight to the local police station, and then he went to Scotland Yard, the police headquarters, at midnight. But unfortunately, they thought he was crazy. They described him as either drunk or mad. This story of a Chinaman being, kidnapped in the centre of London. So Dr. Cantley himself hires detectives to watch the Chinese embassy. And a day or two later, he writes to the Times and he writes to the Foreign Office. The Foreign Office were disturbed. They write to the Home Office and they put a watch on the legation. And the Foreign Office summon Macartney and tell him that he should release Sun Yat-Sen. And on the 23rd of October, he is allowed out of the embassy. So he escapes from the embassy with the help of the British Foreign Office. But, the British Foreign Office, alerted by Dr. Cantley and his continuing pressure. So Sun Yat-Sen stays in London for several more months. And what does he do? The detectives are still following him. And so we know from their report that particularly important is he goes every several times a week, he goes to the reading room in the British Museum to read books, spending up to 6 hours a day there. And we know that he read books on politics, diplomacy, mining, agriculture, engineering, political science, economics, law, and military affairs. I mean, it's a fantastically broad study, and it shows how seriously Sun Yat-Sen took the study of all these topics in his attempt to sort of create a new China, and his working towards the new modern China, which will be different from the old imperial version. So he's spending a huge amount of time studying, reading in the British Museum library. But also when he's in London, he has a chance to see the procession which was held for Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in 1897, with massed ranks, troops, horses, carriages rolling through London. And he also goes to see the Naval Review, where all the ships of the Navy are drawn up in formation. It's very beautiful, very impressive thing. Those are sort of, events that are happening when he's there. But we also know that he visited an enormous number of sort of touristic but also scholarly sites. The Victoria and Albert Museum, the Natural History Museum, the Royal Agricultural Hall in Islington, all of which are still there, the Crystal Palace, which sadly has burnt down since he was there, the Regent Street Polytechnic, a sort of educational centre, and the Library of the Inner Temple, one of the law courts. So he's broadening his understanding of life and of scholarship in general. He also went to the Royal Albert Docks, so he's interested in shipping, shipbuilding and so on, to Kew Gardens, botany, agriculture. He went to the London Zoo quite a few times, and also he visited Madame Tussauds, where he's being more perhaps of a standard tourist, not so much the scholar. And it's still possible in many parts of London to see an enormous number of the buildings that Sun Yat-Sen saw. The bombing in the Second World War destroyed Gray's Inn Place, where he'd had his lodgings, although there is a plaque commemorating his visit. And Sir Halliday Macartney's home in Harley Place, which was also close to the embassy, was also destroyed by bombing. And the Chinese embassy itself was demolished in 1980 and rebuilt in 1983 to 5. But it's rebuilt in very much the same style, the classic Adams style of Portland Place, which are rather handsome, tall, grand buildings. So those can still be seen. But finally, in June 1897, Sun Yat-Sen left England and sailed to Japan. You have to remember, he still has a price on his head. He's still regarded as a dangerous revolutionary. And when he gets back to China eventually, after time in Japan and different places, he is actually often abroad. He's often away. He was one of the great fundraisers for Chinese Revolution. He was in North America raising funds when the 1911 revolution broke out. And after that, he was very briefly proclaimed president of the new Republic of China in 1912. But because of manoeuvring with warlords and different sort of factional powers, he stepped down and Yuan Shikai took over as president. So in his life back in China, he never actually achieved high office again. But his ideas, his principle and his driving force are of major significance and remain important to this day. I mean, he is still regarded as one of the key figures in the creation of New China. Now, I think with China if you think China when he gets back to China and the Republic has been proclaimed in 1912, he's only briefly president, but after that you have a young country, a very young country. And if you think, China's finally thrown off 2,000 years of imperial rule by an emperor at the top of a very traditional bureaucracy, and it faces a world in which things are very different, and which things in China have to be very different again. There are all sorts of things that need to be established, and they are. I mean, China becomes a modern state in terms of things like education, postal services, the establishment of different ministries, the establishment of an interest in technology and the outside world. It has to set up all the things that we think of as being essential to a modern state, and in a very great hurry. I mean, suddenly in 1912, after, as I say, 2,000 years of imperial stagnation, if you like. And then suddenly in 1914, China is faced with the World War. Now, one could think that a European war is very far from China, but China was involved actually from the very beginning of the First World War, because Japanese forces invaded Qingdao, the port of Qingdao, which had been a German colony. The Germans had seized it not long before and made it into a kind of German seaside town, if you like. And right at the very beginning, when it becomes clear that Germany is an enemy and Germany is holding Qingdao, Yuan Shikai offered, the British embassy in Peking offered help to the Allies, but it wasn't in fact until 1917 that China actually officially joined the Allies. But right from the very beginning, China wanted to help. I think it was just often difficult, if you read the diaries of Sir John Jordan, who was the British ambassador at the time, a man very sympathetic to China and really quite close to Yuan Shikai at the beginning. He understood the desire to help, but found it very difficult to organise, given the way that wars were organised in those days. Are you an ally? Are you not an ally? Should you be helping someone or not? But eventually, as I say, in 1917, China officially joins the Allies. But before that, had a chance to help the Allies considerably. It should be said, it's interesting, that Sun Yat-Sen, who at this time was based in Guangzhou, he was not in favour of China joining in the World War, but there were so many different views in China at the time as China sought to find her way, really, through the new morass of international affairs, that his is just one view. Now, one of the most important things that the Chinese did in the First World War was to provide labour assistance. It's all sorts of people, from Churchill through Lloyd George, the British leaders and indeed the French leaders, acknowledged that had it not been for the help of the Chinese Labour Corps, it's quite likely that the war would have been lost. Right at the very outset of the war, there were these ghastly, enormous battles being fought across France and Belgium, and the losses were huge. I mean, there just were not enough men. And that meant that, for example, in France, the factories were emptied as they took men out to serve at the front instead of in the factories. And the British found that they were unable really to sustain their armies without extra help. And in 1916, it was proposed by a Chinese statesman that perhaps China could help with a labour force. This was an unofficial force because of the complications of China hadn't actually joined the Allies. China wasn't on one side or the other, was sort of officially neutral. So the labour force was not, as it were, politically recruited. It was recruited simply as, we might have done in the past. We want Chinese labour to help in the mines in South Africa. Okay, we go and recruit. And France and Britain both, as it were, unofficially recruited Chinese labourers to work until there were well over 150,000 Chinese working in France and near the front of the fighting in the First World War. In France in particular, they were moved into factories and into the fields to replace men who had been taken off to the front. So they worked in factories, fields, utility companies, and the British took a different line and used them particularly as suppliers and backers, really, for the army. So they weren't fighting, but they were quite close to the fighting front. They maintained railways, they maintained roads, they dug trenches, and they moved equipment of all sorts, and they looked after tanks, which gradually came in. They're famous. If you go to the regimental museum of the tank regiment, there's nothing but praise for the Chinese who took care of the tanks, maintaining them, cleaning them, and so on. And as I say, this contribution of labour from China was massive and of huge importance, without which, as Lloyd George did say at one point, he feared that they could not win the war. So China has made a huge contribution to the Allied side in the First World War. Now, I don't think China's initial impetus to help was driven by anything in particular, but as the war dragged on, China did hope that this contribution, as well as China finally joining as a proper ally, would mean that she would be given some consideration at the end of the war, and that, for example, in return for these essential services of the China Labour Corps, that in victory her contribution would be acknowledged, not least by the return of Qingdao to Chinese sovereignty. But as we know, in the treaty at Versailles was an incredibly complex business. It's very difficult to read accounts of what happened in Versailles without becoming immensely cynical, because you see particularly the big four, that you have President Wilson of the US, Clemenceau of France, Lloyd George of England, and the Italian Prime Minister, and they are beset by all these different pressure groups and points about, if I give you this, then they will want that, and people wanting to expand their territory, or expand their control and so on. There's an enormous amount of really rather unpleasant infighting and pressure. And the Japanese exerted a huge amount of pressure at Versailles, having officially been an ally of France, France, Britain and America, an official ally. Japan says, well, we were an ally and therefore we should have this, that and the other, and we demand Chinese territory in return for what we did. In fact, if you count up the Japanese contribution, in terms of sacrifice, there was almost none. They did very, very little, whereas the Chinese Labour Corps lost hundreds of men, some on the way to the battlefronts, some there, not fighting directly, but often, there were shells flying over, disease and so on. So China made a huge human sacrifice in the First World War, which was not acknowledged, and the Japanese walked away from Versailles with control over Qingdao and any other bits of China that she fancied. And this, I think we know, don't we, that as soon as the news of the proposals of the Versailles Treaty, which China didn't sign, wasn't going to sign up to this appalling business in which Qingdao is handed straight over to the Japanese. As soon as the news reached China, and it came by telegraph, it came quickly, it came, in May 1919, as it was announced, there was a massive uprising. Students poured out of the universities all over the place, and hundreds and thousands of people rose up in what became known as the May the 4th movement, which was a reaction to the appalling treatment of China at Versailles. And now when we say May the 4th, we mean much more than just that demonstration, just those few days of shock and horror after the immediate news of Versailles. What we mean is that whole movement, joining up with ideas of Sun Yat-Sen and the other revolutionary leaders, started to create a completely new mood in China, a mood in which the new China was really forged. New ideas came into China, a new language, a new way of communicating, new methods of communication. If you look at the growth of newspapers and journals, they just sprang up all over China. People wanted to know things about the outside world, things about China. They wanted to change things. It was an incredible movement of reform which grew out of this humiliation at Versailles. And it's really throwing off old ways of thinking and casting off the stranglehold of the semi-colonial approach of the Western countries, who were only interested in dividing China up for their own interests. China really stands up, I think, in May the 4th. That's the beginning of new China. And Sun Yat-Sen, with all his study in London, with the amount he'd learnt in London, with the people he'd met and so on, he's hugely part of that. But it also leads very quickly to the formation of the Communist Party. It's a time when new ideas and good ideas come into China, and a whole new country is really born. So we can take it from Sun Yat-Sen in London, what he's learning. He goes back to China, the 1911 revolution, the First World War, and then the reaction to that in May the 4th, and a new China, as it were, is created out of it. But I think one of the things that I find interesting too is if we look back over Sun Yat-Sen in London right up to the First World War, there's an extraordinary sort of legacy, often of people. You have these families which have strong China ties. The Macartney family. You have Sir Halliday Macartney working for the wicked imperial government, but his son, George, who is part Chinese, his mother was a Taiping princess, he becomes the British consul in Kashgar. And if you read anything about Silk Road history, the time when all those explorers were trailing along the Silk Road, all the Germans, von Lecoq and Grunwedel, Paul Pelliot from France, Aurel Stein from England, the Russians as well, they are all welcomed in Kashgar by George Macartney, who provides hospitality, welcomes them into his home and so on. So he's a pivotal figure in Silk Road exploration. And as I say, son of this Halliday Macartney and a Chinese mother. And then you have above all the Cantley family. Dr. James, who taught Sun Yat-Sen and then was really single-handedly responsible for saving him from execution. I mean, it's quite surprising he wasn't actually even killed in the legation, but Cantley's pressure on the Times and the Foreign Office and the Home Office meant that Sun Yat-Sen escaped from his kidnapping in London. And so that was a huge contribution by Dr. Cantley. And then one of Cantley's sons, Kenneth, was appointed advisor to the Chinese Minister of Railways in 1929. And the Cantley family as a whole have for many decades supported education about China, supported information about China through the China Society. And in China, you have the legacy of the Chinese Labour Corps. So there's a long, as it were, history of connections with London, Sun Yat-Sen, and what happens afterwards.